Let's go to Russia's presidential election, where the third and final day of voting is taking place, with a steady trickle of people entering polling stations in a tightly controlled event right across the vast country. Critics of Vladimir Putin gathered at the grave of opposition politician Alexei Navalny in Moscow. His organization said that thousands of people took part in a form of silent protest by forming long queues at polling stations at midday. In the past 2 days, there have been isolated disruptions, such as polling booths being set on fire and dye poured into ballot boxes. But there is little doubt as to what the result will be. Putin will extend his almost quarter century in power by an additional 6 years. DW's Yulia Navalnaya has been based in Riga, Latvia, since Russian authorities closed down DW's Moscow bureau. I earlier asked him if people queuing at polling stations are voting or if they are responding to opposition calls.
Well, let me put it this way. I've never seen so many young people at an election, even queuing up to vote on a Sunday lunchtime. Apart from that, the answer to your question depends on who you ask. The Central Election Commission in Moscow should be happy. Then they can say, hey, Russians are queuing up to fulfill their democratic right and civil duty and vote, and that's exactly what the Kremlin wants. But of course, everyone, and especially the young people, know why they came to the polling stations today, because of the protest called Noon Against Putin. I've seen a video of a 25-year-old friend from Siberia on Instagram where he excitedly says that this is the first time he has joined so many like-minded people in years. So people in Russia and people abroad can see that there are quite a few people who don't agree with Vladimir Putin's policies.
Right. Talking about the election, Yuri, how would you describe it so far, especially when you compare it to previous ones?
Well, I would say on the one hand, this is an election like any other in Russia for many, many years, apart from vandalism here and there, even fire attacks at polling stations. But the winner has long been determined. There is no waiting for the result. On the other hand, this is a completely different election than usual because it's, of course, dominated by war. We've been hearing about attacks on Russia for days. All schools were, for example, closed on Friday in the border region of Belgorod, where there has been heavy shelling from Ukraine for the last few days, with deaths and injuries. And an oil refinery exploded in Samara yesterday, and drone attacks were apparently prevented near Moscow this morning. All of this doesn't really make people in Russia feel hopefully and confident about their future, about the next 6 years with Vladimir Putin as head of state.
Right. DW's Yulia Navalnaya in Riga. Thank you. Thousands of people have lined up at the Russian embassy here in Berlin, ostensibly to cast their vote on the last day of the presidential election in Russia. In fact, the vast majority are there in support of the Noon Against Putin protest called by the organization of opposition politician Alexei Navalny, who died in a Russian prison last month. His widow, Yulia Navalnaya, joined the protesters in Berlin. Also, there was Mikhail Khodorkovsky, a former oil magnate jailed by Putin. Similar protests took place at Russian embassies around the world and in Russia itself. Joining me now is DW's chief international editor, Richard Walker, who is at this protest in Berlin. Hello, Richard. Yulia Navalnaya, the widow of Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny, is taking part in the protest in Berlin. What more can you tell us?
Yeah, well, Eddie, in fact, she's standing right behind us in the line here. I'm not sure if you can see just through to her. Yulia Navalnaya, of course, the widow of Alexei Navalny, the opposition leader who died, obviously, on suspicious circumstances just recently in a Russian prison. It is really, if you think about it, quite remarkable that his widow has come to stand in line just like everybody else here, the thousands of people who have come to the Russian embassy in Berlin to to cast their vote, and for many of them, as you've been saying, making a sort of an implicit protest in so doing. So there she is, in amongst the other voters, standing quietly, saying that she's not going to talk to any media until she's gone into the embassy and cast her ballot, and just like everybody else here. So really quite an extraordinary scene here on the streets of Berlin, a city that, of course, has history with the Navalny family. You remember on the occasion when Alexei Navalny was poisoned under equally suspicious circumstances, he was flown to Berlin for treatment, and it was from here that he then returned to Russia. Now his widow is here wanting to cast her ballot in this election.
Richard, as we say, Navalnaya is expected to vote inside the Russian embassy. That means she'll be on Russian territory. Isn't that a bit of a concern?
Well, I think inevitably that is going to be something of a concern. Of course, there's some inevitable risk potentially that is being taken there, and certainly it is a test for the Russian regime, for the authorities here in the embassy. You know, what do they do? Do they allow her to vote normally, just like anybody else, or do they try to pull something? We simply don't know. And of course, we'll be watching to see when she comes out of the embassy later. The hope is that she will be addressing the protest here. The hope is that she will make it to that, and we'll see what she has to say. But I think evidently making a calculated risk here, taking a calculated risk.
And I don't know, you've not spoken to her yet, as you say, but you've been speaking to some of the other protesters there. What are they telling you?
Yeah, so we've been going up and down the line here, and you can see there really are thousands of people here. They're waiting, I think, at least 3 hours, most people, to get in and cast their ballot. And just to give you a sense of the kind of people here, I mean, most of the people who we spoke to were Putin opponents. We did get the sense of that, but certainly not all. So maybe 60, 70% Putin opponents, and then the others, and broadly, there was a generational divide. Older people tended to be people who were more favorable towards Vladimir Putin. Younger people tended to be those who are here to try to take a stand against him and against the war. And when we spoke to those people, a lot of people said, of course, they don't expect their vote to change anything, but they still want to be the one casting it rather than leaving it completely in the hands of the Russian regime. As for those who are more sympathetic to Vladimir Putin, it was quite interesting. A lot of them were quite hostile towards us as Western media, if you like. One person simply refused to acknowledge that I was trying to talk to him. Another woman told me, really, literally, to go away. So some sense of tension around some of those people, some hostility from some of them. But broadly, I think the atmosphere and the line here has been surprisingly positive. And I think especially the excitement about Yulia Navalnaya being right here in this line with everybody else is a real fillip, I think, to those who are here to try to take a stand against Putin.
Right. DW's Chief International Editor, Richard Walker, thank you.